So today we're going to be taking our penultimate look at Hebrews chapter 11. And next week we're going to wrap it up before we move on to chapter 12. And what we're going to be looking at today are three further illustrations of faith at work taken from events that were recorded in the Old Testament. And these are the last three specific illustrations that the writer to Hebrews gives us. And I think they're three of the best. Now remember that one of the foundational principles of the book of Hebrews is to demonstrate the superiority of Jesus and the superiority of the new covenant of which he's the mediator. And when you compare that to the old system of law and sacrifice that his readers grew up with, he's making these comparisons. And undergirding everything that the writer to Hebrews has been saying is the fundamental difference between these two systems, these two covenants. Because under the old system of law and sacrifice, there was a real tendency, because of the propensity of the human spirit to legalism, to approach God in a more of a kind of ritualistic or an obedience-based way. And so long as you obeyed the rules and offered up the right sacrifices, you'd be okay. But the new covenant is entirely different because it's based on relationship. And the obedience element, while it's still there, it's no longer based on the observation of laws, because those laws are now, under the new covenant, they're actually written on our hearts. And so, God has actually written the ability on our hearts to keep the law. But it's based on a desire to please, and it's based on a response to love. So now faith takes on a new dimension. And the new covenant, which is really an extension of the old Abrahamic covenant that God originally made with Abraham, is all based on a relationship that's based on love, and it operates by faith. And as we begin to look afresh at each of these incidents from the Old Testament, I hope, along with the writer of Hebrews, that it serves to fire up your own faith. I think one of the lessons that I've learnt in looking afresh at all of these accounts in Hebrews 11, all these accounts of faith in action, is that they show us how faith is really a normal part of being in relationship with God. All of these examples are of weak and broken people, just like each one of us. And so that gives me hope that the same kind of faith that worked for these guys way back in time will also work for me today, as I face maybe different crises that are thrown up by the 21st century. But it's no different. It's the same faith. It's the same substance of things hoped for and the assurance of things not seen. And so faith for us will not look any different to the way it did for them, because it's the same God who gives us what we need for life and godliness, and who looks for faith in response to all that he gives to us. Now, we've already looked at many examples of this faith in action as demonstrated by the Old Testament saints that the writer to Hebrews tells us about. And now today we've got three concluding examples that help us to understand the kind of faith that the writer is wanting us to embrace. And I think these are three cracking examples. Each one is a little bit different, but it covers a similar theme. And there's one big question that I hope that we will answer today from these three examples. And that question is, what does faith look like when you're facing the impossible? When the odds are stacked against you, how do you move forward in faith? That is what we're going to be looking at today. So first of all, the writer highlights the faith of the nation of Israel when they encountered the Red Sea. And then he looks at the faith demonstrated by Joshua at Jericho. And finally, he mentions Rahab, who helped the spies sent out by Joshua. So let's look at our verses for today. Hebrews 11, verses 29 to 31. By faith, the people crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. But the Egyptians, when they attempted to do the same, were drowned. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they'd been encircled for 7 days. By faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she'd given a friendly welcome to the spies. Well, what are we going to make of those three examples, I wonder? Well, our first verse today tells us that by faith, the people, and by the people he's talking here about the nation of Israel, crossed the Red Sea as on dry land. But then, as a caveat, the writer says that when the Egyptians tried to do the same thing, they were drowned. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with this part of Exodus, where Israel have left Egypt, but they're being pursued by the Egyptian army, because Pharaoh has once again hardened his heart, and after Israel have left, he goes in pursuit of the Israelites, and his intention is to slaughter them. So when Israel came to the Red Sea, there seems to be no escape. They appear to be trapped. And here is the Egyptian army bearing down on them with all their horses and all their chariots. But God blows an east wind on the sea, causing it to pile up on either side, creating a causeway for Israel to cross on dry land. And seeing the Israelites in the distance crossing over this causeway, the Egyptians begin to make their way across. But when they're halfway across, the wind drops and the sea closes in on them and drowns them all. Well, that's the very bare bones of what happened. So now let's back up a little bit and see where faith comes in. Now, if you've been tracking with us with this series on the book of Hebrews, you might recall something else that the writer said about when Israel left Egypt. And it certainly doesn't show Israel to be the nation that's filled with faith that we're looking at here. In fact, in Hebrews 3 verses 8 to 12, the picture that the writer paints is quite the opposite. He describes them as being evil and unbelieving. And he expands on this unbelieving characteristic of this people in subsequent chapters. So it's not just a passing mention. And actually, interestingly, Paul also picks up on this same characteristic of unbelief displayed by Israel in the wilderness. And he says in 1 Corinthians 10 verses 1 to 5, I don't want you to be unaware, brothers, that our fathers were all under the cloud and all passed through the sea, and all were baptized into Moses in the cloud and in the sea, and all ate the same spiritual food, and all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank from the spiritual rock that followed them, and the rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. Well, if that's the case, how come that the writer to Hebrews now says in chapter 11 that Israel passed through the Red Sea by faith? What changed? Did something change? Well, I think that what's being demonstrated here is that the faith of a remnant has an impact that goes beyond just those whose faith changes the circumstances. So what do I mean by that? Well, I think it will help if we look at another example of how this works. If you've got your Bibles with you, you might want to turn to Acts chapter 27. It's quite a long chapter, so we unfortunately won't have time to read it today. But in Acts chapter 27, we have a very vivid account of Paul embarking on a sea voyage from Israel to Italy. Remember, he's appealed to Caesar, and so now he's being taken under guard from Israel to Italy, and it involves 2 or 3 sea voyages. It's actually an incredible story, and it goes into a lot of real detail about the voyage. And it's where Paul, under the custody of a Roman centurion, early on in the voyage, he receives a prophetic insight that the ship is going to be in danger, and potentially involving both loss of cargo and also loss of life. Now, as the voyage progresses, they run into more very bad weather, so much so that the crew fear that they're going to be shipwrecked. So they plan to escape in the ship's boat, but Paul tells the centurion that unless they stay on board, they will not be saved. So the soldiers cut the rope of the boat and let it drift off. And again, Paul, standing on his faith that God will deliver every one of them to safety, encourages them all to eat some food to give them some strength. And then they threw everything else, all the cargo and everything unnecessary, into the sea just to lighten the ship's load because of the storm. Well, eventually they spotted a bay that had a beach, and they decided that they would try to run the ship aground, which they did. And everyone on board was then either able to swim ashore, or they reached the shore holding on to planks of the broken up ship. And it says that they were all brought safely to land. Now, whose faith was it that saved them? You see, the point is that everyone on board was saved by the faith of that one man, Paul. His actions and his direction, founded on his faith in God, was literally the salvation of everyone on board that ship. You see, it wasn't their faith that saved them. Most of them were clearly not believers. But the faith of a remnant, or in this case, just one man, Paul, was what saved them. And so both in the case of Paul and the shipwreck, and the Israelites crossing the Red Sea, there was temporal deliverance for the unbelievers. And so at the Red Sea, God moved because of the faith of those who did believe. And in a demonstration that genuine faith delivers us from overwhelming problems in the face of impossible odds. Now, if you were there on that day, I wonder what would be going through your mind. There you are, with 2 million or so coming out of Egypt, men, women and children, plus all the animals, right? And you've reached the shores of the Red Sea. But in the distance, coming ever closer, is the sound of horses and chariots. And there seems to be no way across, because the Red Sea at that point is several miles across. So we're talking about standing on the eastern shore of the Sinai Peninsula, looking across the Red Sea towards Saudi Arabia. Or, in fact, it wasn't Saudi Arabia in those days, it was the land of Midian, but anyway, that's where they were. And so they've got this great expanse of water. Think of think of standing at Dover looking across the sea to Calais. You can just about see it in the distance, but there's that impossible distance to cover. Moses stands on the seashore and holds up his staff, and suddenly the water begins to pile up like a wall, leaving an opening across the sea. I don't know if any of you have ever seen that ancient film by Cecil B. DeMille, the Ten Commandments, which has a very graphic, it was made way back in the 60s, I think, something like that. So it was before the days of CGI, where it would look very much more realistic if they made it today. But it was still quite, at the time, it had quite an impact just seeing this water kind of standing like walls with a great big causeway opened up between it. Must have been, if you'd been there, it must have been absolutely amazing. But then faith would say, this is God's provision. He's opened up a way for us to go through. But what are Israel good at? Well, they're good at grumbling, aren't they? And complaining and seeing, the half empty glass instead of the half full one. And so their unbelief would say, is this safe? Water doesn't do that. What if it collapses when I'm halfway across? You see, somebody had to be the first to set foot on the causeway that opened up. And I think it was the faith of those who led the way that persuaded many of the unbelievers to follow them through. You see, it was either stay or get massacred or move on by faith. They were full of fear when they saw the water. But when the waters parted, it opened the door of faith. Sometimes God faces us with stark choices that test our faith. And I think there are two main lessons that we can learn from the account of Israel at the Red Sea. And the first is that faith doesn't exempt us from seemingly impossible problems. In fact, rather, it often seems to lead us into such problems. So let me ask you a question. Was God completely in control when he led Israel out of Egypt? And I'm sure that your answer would be, yes, of course it was. If you were in the room, there would be nodding heads. So God was clearly the prime mover in the whole of the Exodus. And in partnership with Moses as his human representative, he was the one who was leading Israel out of Egypt. And as I said earlier, God knew the hearts of the people, that as a whole, they were an evil and an unbelieving bunch. So he set up some situations that would test Israel's faith, not so much for him to determine their level of faith or lack of it, because he already knew that, but it was more to face Israel with their unbelief and to give them an opportunity to respond in faith. So, by God's direct actions, Israel was faced with an impossible situation. In front of them, an impenetrable stretch of sea barring their way, and behind them, a relentless enemy intent on their slaughter. They were doomed unless God intervened, which of course we know is what he planned to do. But Israel had to learn that salvation is completely from God. There's no place for human ingenuity or some scheme or some means of escape that they could dream up to get out of the danger. So God deliberately led them into this desperate situation in order to teach them to trust him as their only option. And you know what I'm going to say, don't you? He does exactly the same for us. Sometimes he faces us with situations that, from our perspective, seem to be impossible. But, the thing is that God is sovereign. God is in complete control. Nothing ever takes him by surprise. And whenever we face something that we think is impossible, he has hundreds of different ways of solving that problem and resolving it and getting us out of it. Which one will he pick? Well, that's where faith comes in, where we lean on him. We've been singing in the prayer room recently, haven't we, about leaning on our beloved as we come up out of the wilderness. It's the same sort of principle, really, that we lean on him because He is our source of salvation. And not just our spiritual salvation, that we spend eternity with him, but salvation from situations that we face, crises that we face in life. And we just have to reach out and lean on him. So God leads us into situations where he gives us opportunities for our faith to grow. We know in our heads that we need to trust God, but that head knowledge has to turn to action. So he orders our circumstances so that there's no way out if he doesn't intervene. And the second lesson, I think, is this. God delights to turn our overwhelming problems into demonstrations of his mighty power when we trust him. God is an exhibitionist. He loves to demonstrate his mighty power. And the way he does that is to set up impossible situations and then to demonstrate his power and his glory in answering them. And that's exactly what he did at the Red Sea. And he did it again, time after time, while Israel was wandering in the wilderness. Manna, quails, water from the rock. And the way he does this is to intervene with some kind of extraordinary interruption to the natural cause-effect way that nature works. God breaks into the normal way that things work, and in an extraordinary way, he makes them work differently. And it's this demonstration of God's power and glory that's the subject of our next example of faith. Actually, these next two examples are related, but the writer in Hebrews 11 reverses their order. So let's look at remind ourselves what he says next. He says, by faith, the walls of Jericho fell down after they'd been encircled for 7 days. Well, the writer of Hebrews is very minimalistic in his descriptions, as we've already discovered. Just extracting the very bare bones of the story, because there's much more to it than that. And of course, his readers would have been very familiar with the whole story, which is recorded in Joshua chapter 6. So Israel had not long crossed the Jordan River and had entered into the promised land. And they still had that promise of God ringing in their ears. Everywhere that you place your foot, I will give it to you. I will give you the land. But Israel, when they came into the promised land, they were a bit of a sort of raggle-taggle bunch of, people after the wilderness years. There was land to be taken. There were enemies to fight, but they had no experience in warfare, and they didn't know how to fight. And then they came to Jericho. Well, Jericho was the first of many obstacles that God placed in the path of Joshua and Israel in their task of taking the promised land. Jericho was the gateway to the land. And so if they were going to progress any further into the land, they had to defeat it. Seeing it in the distance, they were confronted with this city, this impregnable city that Joshua had pondered how to take it. How could they defeat this city? How could they get into the city even? Because it had defences, it had ditches outside, it had great big thick walls, it had ramparts, it had defences that they didn't have weapons to defeat. And as Joshua was pondering how to take the city, he had an encounter with the commander of the Lord's army. Now we know that this commander of the Lord's army was Jesus in a pre-incarnation appearance. And Joshua asked him if he was for them or against them? You probably remember, are you for us or are you against us? And the answer was, wrong question, Joshua. Who do you serve? But Joshua was then given the strategy to defeat Jericho. Now, although Israel was somewhat naive regarding the rudiments of warfare, I'm sure that they had some kind of inkling that fighting battles involved weapons of some sort. Maybe bows and arrows and spears, perhaps battering rams and things like that. But priests and shofars and shouting and marching around the walls, that all sounds a bit kooky, doesn't it? How's that ever going to work? And, as I was preparing this, I just heard the voice of Isaiah speaking the words of the Lord and saying, in Isaiah 55, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." So many times when it comes to tests of faith, we try to second guess God. But as these verses encourage us, God's ways and his thoughts far transcend our own. His ways and his strategies may appear to be kind of counterintuitive to us sometimes. Sometimes they just appear to be plain weird to our limited human way of thinking. But every one of God's solutions is way better than our most brilliant ideas. Now, that's not to say that God rides roughshod over our intellect and our ability to reason. But, one way or another, God's ways are always centered on faith. Think of it as like kind of bait with which he attracts our attention and thus engages our conversation as we pursue him for the outworking of his purposes in our lives. But before we dive too far down that bunny trail, we must return to the subject of Jericho. Right, so here's the plan. Okay? You all line up with the priests in front, followed by the shofar blowers, and then everyone else. You all walk round the city in silence once each day, and then go back to your camp. Do that for 6 days in a row. And then on the 7th day, walk round the city 7 times. And at the end of the 7th circuit, you blow the shofars and everybody shouts, and then the walls will fall down. I think it probably took more faith to do this than it would have done to attack the city with weapons of conventional warfare. You can have confidence of some sort in bows and arrows and battering rams and catapults and things like that. Physical weapons that can actually inflict damage on the enemy. But the best weapons that we have, the most effective weapons that we have, they're not physical. See, Paul explains it to us. He says, "For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places." So that's the nature of who we're fighting. And then he tells us how we fight. In 2 Corinthians 10:3-6, he says, "For though we walk in the flesh, we're not waging war according to the flesh. For the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. We destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God, and take every thought captive to obey Christ, being ready to punish every disobedience when your obedience is complete." So our greatest weapon then is what? It's prayer. Prayer backed by faith and obedience. And when facing insurmountable odds, it does take faith to respond in prayer. And it may seem like foolishness, but it's God's way of defeating the enemy. It's just like the Israelites walking round the city in silence. It looks like foolishness, but it is God's way. He uses the foolish things of this world to confound the wise. And so he gets us into a room, half a dozen of us, a little bit of worship, a little bit of music, and we read some scriptures, and we come into agreement with those scriptures, and we come into agreement with what God is saying and what God is saying. We say back to God what he's already told us to say to him. That's how prayer works. And it changes things. And things that we are facing that are seemingly impossible, they're changed. Walls come down physically, just simply by speaking words to God. You see, God delights in slaying the pride of men. He slayed the pride of the city of Jericho by causing the walls to collapse in the most foolish possible way. He sent a young teenager to defeat Goliath, and he sent the Philistines running. He slayed the pride of Israel, saying, "You just walk round the city, I'll knock the walls down myself." When Israel crossed the Jordan, they burned their bridges. There was no going back. Well, there was nowhere to go back to. They had to keep moving forward, and they had to start learning to live by faith. And you know, the same thing happened to you when you crossed the Jordan. When you gave your life to the Lord, you burnt your bridges. The only way is forward, learning how to live by faith. And that's why the writer of Hebrews has given us so many examples and expended so much time teaching us about the necessity of faith. Faith doesn't come naturally to us. It's something we have to cultivate. And we cultivate that through our relationship with God. So why did God choose this unconventional approach to Jericho? It was to hammer home to Israel that you can have victory over powerful enemies, but only when you don't trust in your own abilities, but totally trust in God. So, every time Israel circled the city, they were being reminded, you cannot conquer this city in your strength. You must trust in my power. You see, often our problem is not that we're too weak, but we think we're stronger than we really are. And again, it comes back to this pride thing. So God looks for ways to kill our pride by highlighting his power against our weakness. And before we leave Jericho, there's one more factor that we need to consider. Israel's success was dependent on their knowing what to do. Now, in this instance, they had the distinct advantage of hearing what to do directly from God himself. In Joshua 6, we read that the Lord gave Joshua a detailed strategy for what they were going to do. Now, though many of us, in fact probably all of us, would love to hear the audible voice of God giving us insight when we're facing a Jericho-type situation, these days it's very rare, extremely rare. But we do have a book full of God's insight, his revelation, his strategy for any given situation. And the more we get to know it, the more prepared we can be to face whatever comes our way. Of course, it won't necessarily give you a direct strategy for any given situation, but what it will do is it will give us a framework for victorious living. You know, what Carol's been teaching us about the kingdom of God and what I'm teaching about faith will hopefully cause you to go to the scriptures to seek out how we can live victoriously in 2021. And I know we talk about meditation on the word a lot. It's a valuable tool to help us to get the most out of the word of God. Asking God questions as we encounter him in the word just opens up a whole new dimension of revelation. And it all helps to equip us so that we're able to make wise and godly choices and decisions in this life. Paul tells us in Ephesians 1 that every spiritual blessing in the heavenly places is available to us through Jesus. And the best way of getting to know him is through his written word. And when we know the heart and the mind of Jesus, we know then who will be able to lead us and guide us in our own personal battles of Jericho. Well, let's move on and turn our attention to the last example, Rahab. So the writer says, by faith, Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she was given a friendly welcome. She had given a friendly welcome to the spies. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with this part of the story. I think that a lot of people find the inclusion of Rahab in the list of examples of faith a little bit surprising. She's actually only the second woman in the list, and remember, Sarah was the other one. She was also a Gentile, and technically at least she was, because she was a citizen of Jericho, she was an enemy of Israel. And of course, we mustn't forget that she's also described as a harlot, or in some translations, a prostitute. Probably not the sort of person that good Jewish boys that Joshua sent out to spy on the city should get involved with. Oh, and of course she lied to the king of Jericho when questioned about the spies. And to make matters worse, she was a Canaanite. And just to compound the issue, she was also an Amorite. And that's one of the tribes that God had commissioned Israel to destroy. So when you look at her track record, she would seem to be a very unlikely candidate to receive God's favour. But she did. And it was because of her faith, according to the writer of Hebrews. And when you read her story in Joshua 2, it gives us some insight into why she deserves her place in this so-called Hall of Fame in chapter 11. Now, in case you're not familiar with the story, Joshua sent 2 spies to Jericho to get some first-hand information about the city's layout and its defences and so on. And so they went to the city and they found lodgings at Rahab's boarding house. And although they tried to be as inconspicuous as possible, but it seems that they were spotted, and the news of their presence in the city was given to the king of Jericho. And then the king sent messengers to Rahab asking after the men, but she misled them, saying that the men had left the city the night before. However, in reality, she had hidden them among some flax stalks on her roof. And after the king's messengers had gone, she spoke to the spies and told them that all of Jericho feared their God, because they'd heard how God had dried up the Red Sea for them to cross, and they knew that God had given them the land. And then she made her confession, which we can read in Joshua 2 verse 11. She said, "And as soon as we heard it, our hearts melted, and there was no spirit left in any man because of you. For the Lord your God, he is God in the heavens above and on the earth beneath." Well, then she made a bargain with the spies. In return for her help to escape from the city, they would guarantee safety for her and for her family when Israel came and took the city. Now let's answer a couple of questions that this story of Rahab raises. I guess you might be curious to know why the spies chose to lodge in the house of a harlot. Well, clearly they didn't go there to engage in the services of a prostitute. They went there because it was a good hiding place. Houses such as this would have been open, especially at night when the men arrived. And harlots will receive their guests without discrimination or asking too many questions. And that's why the king of Jericho so readily accepted Rahab's story that these men had only stayed for a short while and then departed, he put two and two together and come to the wrong conclusion, but for him, the right one. But there's another reason behind this, and that is that God's providence was at stake here. He'd seen Rahab's heart, and his grace had reached down to her. You know, the spies didn't know when they went there that God had another mission for them besides spying. And sometimes, you know, when God sends us out with one thing in mind, he's actually got another purpose that only gets revealed as a result of our obedience to that first purpose. And another question that might be troubling you is Rahab's response to the king's messengers. It was quite plainly a lie designed to mislead the authorities. Now, I don't think that there's any way that we can defend Rahab. In fact, for her, it was probably just a natural instinctive response. We have to remember that although she'd come to a realization that the God of Israel was the true God of heaven and earth, she'd not yet come into a relationship with him. That would come later. So I think the way that I would look at it is that Rahab didn't have to lie in order to save the spies. If she'd chosen to be honest in her response, God would have had another way of resolving the situation. You see, God is never hemmed in such a way that he can't provide a means of escape if that's his purpose. So we don't defend and we don't justify Rahab's lie in any way, but neither do we condemn her. Because here we see the grace of God at work in someone who's glimpsed the glory of God and wants to pursue him wholeheartedly. Actually, it took great courage to do what she did in hiding the spies. Because in the natural, there was absolutely no chance that Israel could conquer Jericho. It was just too strong, just too powerful for that to happen. But she staked her life on the fact that God said that they would do it. And she risked everything to be included in Israel's success. She wanted to be on God's side. So how did she demonstrate the faith that she's commended for? She had to trust the spies that they would be true to their word. Something prompted her to embark upon this course of action. And all she had to go on was a conviction that the God of Israel was not one to be messed with. He was powerful and he meant business. But instead of responding like everyone else in the city with fear, something in her heart sparked that mustard seed of faith. And that faith led her into action. So she first of all hid the spies, and then she provided a way of escape for them. She kept her part of the bargain. But how did she know that they would keep theirs? They were the enemy after all. And then she had to obey the explicit instructions that the spies gave her, to put that scarlet cord in her window and to gather all of her family together in her house, ready for their salvation. It was her faith that led to blessing for the whole family. Well, the story has a happy ending. You see, when the walls of Jericho came down, Joshua sent those same two young men that he'd sent to spy on the city to go and rescue Rahab and her family and to bring them out into safety. And you know, the good news doesn't stop there. Because Rahab is not just remembered by the writer to Hebrews. She's also mentioned by Matthew in his genealogy of Jesus in chapter 1 of his gospel. Because Rahab, the Gentile woman, the Canaanite, the Amorite, joined herself to the Jewish community of Israel. And she married a Jewish man called Salmon. And they had a son called Boaz, who married another a Gentile woman called Ruth. And they had a son called Obed, who was the father of Jesse, who just happened to be the father of David, who became king of Israel. Yes. Rahab the harlot was included in the messianic line that ultimately led to the birth of Jesus. And that's God's grace. He can take the most unlikely candidate for salvation, a weak and broken woman scarred by an ugly way of life, living in a city of wickedness beyond measure, and he can transform her into something beautiful and fruitful. And if he can do that with the likes of Rahab, then he can do it with any one of us. All it takes is a little bit of faith. It doesn't even need a lot of faith. I think by now that we're beginning to realize what a powerful thing faith is, and how God responds sometimes in miraculous ways when we set aside our own feelings and ambitions for the sake of God's purposes being worked out in our lives. Throughout this series on faith, we've encountered many different aspects and many different dimensions of faith demonstrated in the lives of such diverse people from biblical history. But broadly, I think the kind of faith that we need in our everyday lives can be categorized in 5 different ways. First, there is faith that receives. This is the faith that we had when we first came to Jesus for salvation. It's the faith that initiates our relationship with him, and then it continually draws us into his presence day by day to receive the grace that he lavishes upon us. Secondly, there is the faith that reckons. That's the faith that counts on God to undertake for us. It's the faith that says, I can't, but I know someone who can. It's the faith that leans on God when we're feeling weak to receive his strength. It's a faith that reckons that God is able. Third, there's the faith that takes risks. It's the faith that dares to do something for God that appears to be impossible, like walking in silence round a city, like hiding spies. It's faith that leads to action in the face of adverse circumstances. Fourth, there's the faith that rests. It's the faith that gives us assurance that when we're in the midst of pain and suffering, we can sit back in confidence that God will deliver. It's the faith that enables patience and endurance. And then fifthly, there is the faith that resists. Paul highlights this aspect of faith in Ephesians 6, where he encourages us to take up that great shield of faith, because with it we can extinguish all the fiery darts of the evil one. Well, next time we'll conclude our time in Hebrews 11, looking at some of the unnamed heroes of the faith and bringing the whole chapter into an exciting conclusion. But I want to leave you today with my encouraging verse to take with you into this week. And it comes from 1 Corinthians 16, verse 13. And it simply says this: be on your guard. Stand firm in the faith. Be courageous. Be strong.